Welcome. So this is, I believe, our 28th webinar since we started running these things to tell people about our work in addressing climate change through entrepreneurship and the Carbon 13 Venture Builder. I'm Chris Coleridge, and I am the founder and CEO of Carbon 13. And I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm American, but I've lived in the UK for 30 years now, more than 30.7 years, something in that neighborhood. And I was an entrepreneur as a young man, sold my business around the turn of the millennium, and decided, my kids came along, I decided to become an academic. I've been teaching strategy and entrepreneurship in business schools since well, for 16 years now. For many of those years, I was teaching at University College London, and towards the end of that time, I ran their master's degree in technology entrepreneurship. I then went to, I joined Cambridge University's faculty 4.5 years ago, and set up a master's degree in entrepreneurship for them. But I decided or realized that I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life running master's degrees. It's a pleasant thing to do, but almost too pleasant. The great issue that threatens humanity's existence is climate change. And where everything I know about innovation, everything I know about entrepreneurship tells me that where there's a big problem, there's also a major opportunity for entrepreneurship. And so that's really what, that's the genesis of Carbon 13. I've been telling my kids for a long time, when my kids were little, I said, don't worry too much about climate change because, you know, there's a lot of clever people out there in the world and they will figure it out. And I'm a little more worried now than I was when my kids were little, that we're just not doing it fast enough. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Well, I'll say a little bit more about that now. We all have the feeling, and correctly, that the economy is decarbonizing, right? That's right, it is. We are making a transition to renewables. We're making a transition where lots of transport, for example, that was powered by fossil fuels is moving to electricity. And there's a nice harmony there where as the grid gets cleaner, then the electricity used to power transport gets cleaner. And we have a sort of, you know, two tracks of improvement. But here's the problem. The problem is we're not doing it nearly fast enough. And what is in my mind a bigger problem is that if you extrapolate all of the current trajectories of, you know, moving completely to renewable energy technologies, completely electrifying transport, all these things, it's all of that together when that process is complete is not enough to put us in a situation where the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere are going to be low enough, according to the scientists I follow on this, that we're going to have an undisrupted way of life, right? I mean, people in the sustainability world, in the climate change world, talk about working for a 1.5 degree heating world, which by the way is still hotter than it is right now, and a 2 degree maximum. The scientists that I follow on this suggest that it's very unlikely that we are going to get a 2 degree world. We're more likely to get a 3 or 4 degree world, which means major disruption to the food system of this planet, large parts of the planet becoming uninhabitable, and really very serious problems. So we have to not only sort of follow through on the trajectories that have already started, but we have to find some new trajectories, right? And those are trajectories of change in consumers' behavior, trajectories in change in the way that corporates do business and that industry does business and so on, right? And to flatten the climate curve, right? To make a difference to emissions that reduces the severity of the peak that we're facing. One of the tools is entrepreneurship. One of the tools to address this is entrepreneurship. Now, I'm not for a moment claiming that entrepreneurship is the only thing that, you know, is the sovereign cure for everything. Not at all, right? Entrepreneurship is a social institution that humanity has created to solve a certain class of innovation problem. And I'll say what those innovation problems are, the ones that entrepreneurs typically solve rather than corporates or anybody else. So for certain types of innovation problem, and ones which I'll explain that are very relevant to the climate crisis and to the changes that we need to see, entrepreneurship is part of the answer. Now, I actually have a great deal of sympathy with Extinction Rebellion, or at least with people who look at the science, look at this reality and say, wow, this is the most serious problem humanity is facing. I've got to, you know, devote my life to activism or whatever it is. However, it's my contention or my argument that we are not going to have time to change capitalism and change politics and change sort of the whole way the world works and then solve climate change. It's my contention that we have to use the tools that we've already got, because we haven't got time to invent new tools, right? Now, entrepreneurship, if you follow my logic that it's a tool, that's a social institution that's a tool for solving certain kinds of problems, entrepreneurship will actually change in response to the threats and opportunities that climate change presents, the same way everything else is going to change, right? The same way everything else is going to change. There's you know, if you read the Financial Times, as a business school lecturer, I do read the Financial Times sort of as a professional obligation. If you read the Financial Times, you will see an article every single week saying finance, the whole face of finance is changing, the whole face of this part of society is changing because already of the pressures that climate change is putting on humanity, and that process will continue. So entrepreneurship is there. It's a vector for change. It's a vector for changing consumers' behavior. It's a vector for changing institutions' behavior. It's a vector that goes across international boundaries, right? I mean, it's not one of the things that we've seen. Obviously, everyone got very excited about, well, we've got to get Trump out and we've got to get a Democratic Senate, and the US has to get back on the sort of path of sanity as far as the climate is concerned. So what did we get? We got, it looks like, Trump out and not a Democratic Senate. There will continue to be a sort of split country, a divided country in the US. We are not going to be able to look to them to provide the leadership that perhaps, you know, past world crises have sort of, you know, the Americans have stepped up and taken a certain paternalistic role towards the whole, towards the crisis that humanity faced. That's not going to happen this time. Something that we can do right now is start ventures that are quite ambitious. I'm not talking about little sort of community ventures that can change the way consumers behave in Europe, but also in Asia, also in North America, also in all parts of the world, that can help industry, can help corporates do business in a low carbon way, a net zero way, in lots of parts of the world. So that's what we're doing here, is we're using the tool of entrepreneurship to address the climate crisis. Now, Carbon 13 is at its root a community. What we know about innovation, everything that I've studied and understood about innovation over the last couple of decades tells me that if you want breakthrough innovations, if you need major innovations, they always arise from a sort of cluster. They always arise from a cluster. One of the most famous examples of this is the coffee houses of London in the 17th century. They were a new social institution. They were a sort of democratic, anybody can go in and buy a cup of coffee. Wasn't divided on sort of class lines, political lines, what profession or sort of social role people played. It was a clash of consciousnesses kind of meeting place, where you got scientists, you got philosophers, you got politicians, you got people coming back from what used to be called newly discovered parts of the world. Of course, the parts of the world were sitting there already, but that's a different story. The diversity of perspective and mindset, the new money meeting the old money, the science meeting the religion, and so on. The ideas that came out of those coffee houses were actually they were influential. They laid the foundation for the Industrial Revolution, which, by the way, is why we're sitting on this webinar right now, is because the ideas were so powerful that they kind of went too far, right? So it may sound immodest, but fundamentally, Carbon 13 is trying to pull off the same trick, the same idea, right? Bring together a community, make sure by design that the community is filled with people who are diverse in perspective, diverse in background, diverse in thinking, and take those people through a systematic process that I know from my own experience, we know from other entrepreneurship and other sort of innovation programs that are around, will generate interesting startups. Right? Startups that have the potential to really move the needle on carbon, and we call these net zero startups. Right? Now, we ask everyone who applies to our program, we ask them to commit to doing something which has the potential to take 10 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per annum out of the emissions base. Now, that's a major company, right? A company that succeeds in doing that. It's a large-ish business, right? It is not, there's lots of startups at the moment which are, if you look at ecology.com, and I'm not picking on them, right? I'm just using them as an example. This is a company which is selling individual consumers the opportunity to make themselves carbon neutral by buying buying forestry projects. Now, there's a whole bunch of challenges in their model, which I'm not. My point in bringing them up is not to do them down. So I'm not going to kind of list all the flaws, right? But my point in bringing them up is that back of the envelope calculation, it is very, very difficult to see how this business could ever take a serious amount of emissions out of the emissions base, right? It's just not. It just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. It's not a fundamental enough change to the way people behave, etc. It doesn't drive a fundamental enough change to the way that people behave. So we're not looking for businesses that are sort of, an app that helps you track your carbon footprint, right? That's another example of a type of business where, yeah, it sounds like it should make a difference, but it's very difficult to do the maths and come out with a number that says, yeah, if that succeeds, then that's really going to drive a major change in carbon, right? So what we are looking for, I'll say a bit about where good ideas come from in a minute. But what we are looking for is changes that are fundamental and systemic, right? Innovations that actually revolutionize an industry, if you can stomach that kind of language, that make quite a significant change. Now, one of the first things that I did when I started on this journey was to get a group of my students to look at startups that are already out there and say, okay, is it plausible, is it realistic that a startup could take, if it succeeds, could take 10 million tons? Is 10 million tons an appropriate benchmark, right? And they looked at the Clean Tech 100. And our objective was not precision, right? Not to say what is the exact carbon avoided emissions is the term in the sort of in the business. What is the exact amount of avoided emissions? It was just to validate, is 10 million tons a pipe dream, a fantasy, or is it sort of plausible, right? So we looked, and we quite quickly found startups that are growing fast, that are already out there, that are succeeding, that are already making a significant impact on carbon emissions, and if they reach their potential, have the potential to do far more than 10 million tons per annum out of the emissions base. So the plan, the Carbon 13 plan, the Carbon 13 vision, if you like, is that over the next 5 years, we're going to run 20 cohorts of our Venture Builder program. That means 1,000 would-be entrepreneurs in our program. That we, based on other programs that have a similar structure, a similar sort of approach, but are not climate change based, we'd expect those 1,000 people to found something in the neighborhood of 125 to 150 potentially viable businesses. And then our objective is that enough of those businesses will succeed that we will take collectively at least 400 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions out of the emissions base. That is roughly 1% of global emissions, or if we want to think about it another way, it's roughly the UK's emissions. It's roughly the emissions of the UK. But we're not a UK, we are a UK-based organization, but we're not particularly trying to be UK centric. So we prefer to think of it as 1% of global emissions rather than be too focused on the UK. Now, Greta Thunberg has been on the airwaves quite a bit in the last 6 weeks or so. And her message is fundamentally, in the 2 years since I've been famous, Greta, have been famous, we haven't really done much. No progress has been made. And that's broadly correct, I'm sorry to say. I mean, go back 2 slides ago, the level of decarbonization is just not at the level that we need it to be at. There is only one thing that I would point to in the last 2 years that represents real progress, and that is the rise of the net zero pledge. Right? So the net zero pledge is large corporates, getting close to 1,000 now, making 1,000 corporates who have done this, making some kind of pledge to reduce the emissions from their business to net zero by date X. Right? Sometimes that date X is satisfyingly close in the future, and we think, okay, yeah, that is good. That's good stuff. Sometimes that date is too far in the future, and it represents a starting point. And one of the corporate's favorite words is journey, right? They say, oh, we're on a journey. We recognize that things are not where they need to be, and we're on a journey to fix it, right? The journey is going to take some time, etc. The net zero pledge represents potential customers, right? From an entrepreneur's point of view, it represents potential customers. Those corporates, and I've talked to many of them, many of them over the last 2 years, those corporates have made a plan, right? Very few of them have got no plan at all, right? But they've made a plan. They will quite openly say, oh, it's a bit sketchy at the moment. We're sort of working out the details and so on. What the plans generally involve is a certain amount of improvement of the reduction of the carbon intensity of their operations, combined with buying some offsets, right? So buying some traded carbon credits. Now, there is a fundamental issue in this whole apparatus that's been set up, which is that the prices that these the prices that these corporates are using for carbon credits are too low, unrealistically low, and so when they make their plan, it's sort of based on on today's price, when clearly with all these corporates buying more and more credits, the prices are only going to go up. There's also a problem with certain kinds of offsets, and I don't mean to make this into a technical lecture, but there's a problem with certain kinds of offsets, which is double counting, right? That different corporates might figure out ways to buy the same carbon positive behavior that somebody in some part of the world is engaging in twice, right? So if you talk to the senior managers who are responsible for this area within these corporates, what you find out is that they know that this plan, they put a plan together and that's already an achievement, but they recognize that the plan has some holes in it. And what they really need, what I've seen over and over and over again, is what they need is innovations that will genuinely reduce the carbon intensity of their activities, right? I mean, what do corporates need to do? They need to make money, they need to make revenues, and they need to cut their costs or keep their costs under control. Those are the two, that's business, right? So they need low carbon intensity ways of generating revenue, and they need lower carbon intensity ways of doing what they are already doing, right? Or doing their operations, right? And so over and over again, I've had the conversation where they say, wow, if you're going to generate ventures that can sell us a new value proposition, a new process, a new way of a new business model, a new way of doing things that is low carbon intensity, we really want to have a look at that. Right? So that is, that's the pull factor, right? Like there's customers out there. That's one of, fundamental preconditions that you have for doing successful entrepreneurship is there's customers with a problem. They don't know how to solve the problem. They're looking for somebody, an innovator to solve the problem for them. And that's where the entrepreneur comes in. Now, of course, the other side is consumers. Unless I'm encouraged by the shifts I'm seeing in consumer behavior, but I'm cautious about them. Remember that they're mostly in Northern Europe. Remember that they are, there are not very many people. There are not very many people out there, and to be honest, I don't think there ever will be that many people out there who say the primary way I'm going to make my consumption decisions is based on carbon footprint. People just don't. That's just not how people. I studied social psychology among other things, so that's just not how people are, right? People. There are a certain percentage of people in the world who are self-sacrificing and sort of think of the bigger picture and the society that they're a part of, and so on. It's a small number of people, and it's ever was thus, right? So when I talk about changing consumer behavior, I'm not talking about getting consumers to do something that they'd really rather not do, because that just doesn't happen. That's not possible. I'm talking about finding ways to solve a customer's problem in a way that's as good or better than their current way of solving the problem, and also happens to be less carbon intensive. Okay. I must press on. All right. So on to saying some things about, I want to say some things about how you come up with good ideas. What are the 4 types of innovation problems that entrepreneurs solve rather than corporate solve? And the title of this webinar is about de-risking the startup process. So I want to make sure that I leave time to say a bit about that. But now I've got a couple of slides where we're going to describe the program, try to answer the question, are you right for the program? Should you apply to the program, and so on? And sort of address those, because I have a bad habit in past webinars of leaving these slides to the end, and then I run out of time, and then what people came on the webinar to discuss was the program, and they go away seriously enriched in their knowledge about climate change entrepreneurship, but still having lots of questions about the program. So let's talk about the program. So the program exists to bring together 3 types of founders, right? I talked earlier about cohorts. So we bring together a cohort of 50 founders, and that cohort is made up of 20 technical founders, 20 commercial founders, and 10 what we call wildcard founders. So complementarity of skills, of perspective, of mindset, etc., is baked into the whole concept, right? I talked about I mentioned The D word, diversity, on a previous slide, right? On a previous slide, I was talking about diversity in the sense of different people from different perspectives coming together, right? As I've been on this journey over the last 18 months, I've seen engineers who think that, I've talked to so many different people, engineers who think that fundamentally climate change is an engineering problem, right? I've talked to social impact entrepreneurs who say it's fundamentally a sort of consciousness raising problem, right? I've talked to, I've talked to lots of different types of innovators who are interested in this. And what I recognize is that those people, everybody should be talking to each other, right? The engineers are only talking to their fellow engineers, and the social impact entrepreneurs are only talking to their fellow social impact entrepreneurs. And we're getting a sort of siloed approach, which often happens in the innovation world, right? But for the kinds of game changers that we need to bring together diverse people. Now, when I say diversity, do I also mean the other kind of diversity that we've all been talking about? Me Too, Black Lives Matter, etc. Right? Well, yes, I do mean that. Right? We know that. Well, we know quite a few things. We know that there's untapped talent out there. Right? There are people who are brilliant and have a lot to contribute, but are put off from getting in the entrepreneurship game because they feel like they don't fit their face doesn't fit, they don't fit the mold, etc., etc., etc. Right? So one of the things that Carbon 13 and our talent, what we call our talent first approach, can do is create an environment where people like that are welcomed and, you know, face a culture where their presence is seen as a positive, not as tokenism. You know, as a net positive, right? Not a net neutral, but a net positive, right? More diversity equals more likelihood of game changers. We have growing evidence, more studies every month, showing that entrepreneurship teams, and team is really, the founding team concept is really important to Carbon 13. Teams with women in them do better than teams with no women in them. We don't have the answer to the question, why is that? Right? I mean, we can all come up with our sort of common sense. Well, you know, women are better in this respect and that respect, and that's what you need in innovation. I mean, I could tell you stories like that from now till kingdom come. I'm an academic, so I won't say, oh yeah, there's a study that shows that it's because women are better in this respect. I can just tell you that there's more and more studies showing teams with women do better. You know, if you push me against a wall and force me to come up with some kind of commentary, I won't say explanation, but commentary, I will point to the diversity explanation, right? I will point to teams with women in them are much more likely to be diverse. And we have so many studies going back to the 50s that show that diverse teams do a better job in innovation. So, you know, do we need to add layers of complexity to the story about, you know, well, yeah, and women are specifically better at doing this one thing that we really need in innovation? You know, okay, all right. So 3 types of founders coming together in the cohort. Technical founders are intended to be the chief technical officers of their ventures. Right? They need to be engineers or scientists or computer scientists or developers, shall we say. And investors want to invest in ventures that have a technical cornerstone, right? I can't put it any more plainly than that. That is, they have a natural predisposition that they prefer to see a team that includes a technical person in the team. There's lots of reasons for that. Technical people are super smart. You have to get really, really good grades and be very clever to get into a technical sort of the technical side of things. There is a correlation between some of those technical skills and being able to build stuff, right? And building stuff is only part of what entrepreneurship is about, right? You can build a prototype, but if the prototype doesn't actually match what is needed in the world and needed by the customers, then the prototype is pretty useless. but technical founders are the sort of one of the cornerstones. The second type of founders is commercial founders. Now, commercial founders are responsible for sales, building bridges, building relationships internally, the team, and externally, the customer and the other relationships that are needed to get a business off the ground. Things that are working in this space, in the climate change space, tend to be what we call ecosystem businesses, where they're not just coming up with a product and selling it to the customer, but they're also trying to work with lots of other counterparts in a way that's going to inspire or leverage some change. And so we're not just talking about sales, we're not just talking about team building, we're talking about sort of network building. The commercial founders will either be serial entrepreneurs, and I don't necessarily, I mean, some of the applications we've had are from very successful serial entrepreneurs, but when I say serial entrepreneurs, I mean people who have been through at least a few steps of the entrepreneurial process. That may not have been horribly successful. That's generally the way with these kinds of things, but they've got an understanding of what it takes to get through those first few steps. Also, commercial founders are coming from industry, right? And especially if they have strong credibility and social capital around who the first customers for a venture might be. Right? And then we've got the wildcard founders. So the wildcard founders is, in simple terms, we can say it's people with those industry networks, but their experience level maybe doesn't prepare them to be the CEO, or people with really important startup skills. They've been in startups, they've gained some startup key skills for startups like product management, sales, design. But again, they're not quite the expertise that they're bringing to the table isn't CTO level, if you like. Wildcards is also our get out because of we really believe in what we're saying about diversity and diversity of perspective and mindset. If someone comes to us and they are clearly an extraordinary person, a needle moving person. Great question, Amar, in the chat. Thank you very much. I'll come back to it in a minute. Then, we're interested to engage with you. All right. And the idea is that these founders will come together in teams of typically 2, sometimes 3, and get working on a venture. This is the structure of the program. It's an 8-month program. Our first cohort starts on the 2nd of March, and applications for that cohort close on the 3rd of January. Applications are assessed on a rolling basis, so please don't wait till the 3rd of January. Entrepreneurs generally do wait to the last minute, in my experience, but please don't. Yeah, so I'll say a bit more about the application process in a minute. The first month of the program is about forming teams. And if you form a team with 1 or possibly 2 others, then you go through to the next stage of the program. If you don't form a team, you're off the program and you can apply to the next cohort if you wish. The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th month, the team is working on developing and getting some proof points. I'll say a bit more about that later. Some proof points around the idea, right? Standing it on its feet to the extent where it looks, hey, this might be worth building. This might be worth pursuing. At that 4-month point, halfway through the program, the teams pitch our internal investment committee, and we think, based on other programs that we've run and that we've seen, something like 15 teams are going to make it through to the second phase, to this 3-month second phase. 8 to 10 of those teams will receive an investment of £75,000, a net £75,000 pre-seed investment. And then there's another 4 months That's more like kind of traditional startup accelerator. We've invested in you. We're your business partners. We want to see you succeed. That's our business model, is to see you succeed. So we work very hard with you to get you the introductions, get you the advice, get you the support, and get you the funding at the 8-month point that is going to enable you to continue to make progress, grow, succeed, and so on, right? Okay. Oh, and I should have mentioned that during the first 4 months of the program, right, phase 1 and phase 2 of the program, each participant on the program is paid a £1,000 a month stipend. Okay, I'm going to pause. Well, maybe I won't pause. Maybe I'll say one more slide and then I'll pause and take questions. So, trying to boil it down, what's the value that we provide? Why does Carbon 13 have a right to exist? Why don't entrepreneurs just get on with it? Well, okay, we've raised a pot of money to invest in ventures and to pay these stipends and to run our program and so on. Accelerators, if they work properly, accelerate, right? Typically, businesses that don't go through the Bowhurst, a sort of private equity research firm, did some interesting research on accelerators recently, and they found a number of things. One is average length of time normally without an accelerator from teams getting together to raising what's called the Series A fundraising round, which is the point where you're raising a couple of million to, you've sort of cracked the basic problems of the business, and now it's a race. Now it's like, okay, we think this is definitely worth doing, and we're going to build it as fast as possible, and it's all about growth at that point. The typical time from founding to Series A is about 40 months. And accelerators, the ones that work, reduce that to about 26 months. Now, that's really fundamental for 2 reasons. One is most entrepreneurs only have a certain, we're all only going to live a certain number of years. And so there's only a certain number of years that you can afford. And I mean, both financially and in terms of your loved ones' belief in you and so on, to put into entrepreneurship and a venture building process, right? So accelerating, shrinking that period of time is actually really valuable from the entrepreneur's point of view. It's also really valuable from investors' point of view, right? If you know anything about finance, you know that fundamentally one of the things investors are concerned about is not just how much of a return am I going to get, but when am I going to get that return, right? How long is it going to take? And so chopping a year off the process makes a big, big, big difference to the investors' returns, right? So that's a sort of that's another aspect of why acceleration is so important. Why does an accelerator, a good accelerator, accelerate? It accelerates because of accountability, right? You're on the program, you're working with experts, you're working with our team. There's 3 kind of core team members: myself, Dr. Nikki D, who's a sustainable technology expert, sort of fellow at Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, the fellow at the Institute for Manufacturing in Cambridge, and she's really one of the leading experts in the whole country on sustainable technology. And then our other core team member is Michael Languth, who a long time ago, many years ago, was my student, but then went on to become a far more successful entrepreneur than I've ever been, and has developed his company, and now has exited his company, having taken it past the Series B stage, and is looking to work with climate change ventures. So that's the 3 of us. We have a team of domain experts that is literally getting to the point where it's as long as my arm, and those domain experts are in finance and management areas, marketing and so on, but also in the technical domains of relating to carbon emissions, right? Around buildings, around manufacturing, around food, around agritech, around energy, around transport and mobility, and so on, right? One of the reasons that a good accelerator helps you accelerate is that in design thinking, we have a very important concept, which is you have to get the balance right between divergence and convergence, right? So when you're designing something, you go through multiple cycles of divergence where you kind of open your mind up and your network up and to new ideas, right? New possibilities. But then you have to balance that divergence with a period of convergence where you say, okay, I've now generated 1,000 possibilities. What's a good decision-making system for cutting out 980 of those possibilities and then ranking the other 20 possibilities and seeing how we're going to prioritize those and actually come to a point where there's a provisional project that we're actually working on, right? So that's helping you sort of alternate effectively between, okay, this is a divergence period and now we're in a convergence period, and now divergence and now convergence and so on. That's part of what we help with. I've mentioned the community. I won't labor the point. Diversity, energy, right? Working with alongside other teams who may be working in a different sort of industry vertical, but have shared the same purpose as you, reducing carbon emissions. And we know lots of research shows us, and I've seen it on many programs that I've run, that if you have a collective of entrepreneurs who are not working all on the same problem, but have each their own take on it, that you get lots of useful spillover, right? Where you meet a contact or an investor, let's say, who is not going to invest in your buildings startup, but is interested in agritech. Well, yeah, you happen to know an agritech startup that's part of your cohort and some people that you've got to know and so on. And it's not just investment, it's also just contacts and sort of even knowledge at the early stages. Even they run across something that you should know, right? And they know, and they put it in front of you. So it's sort of having it's expanding your scanning network, your sort of scanning and ideating network. And then I've already touched on our experts. So we have two types of experts: domain experts and entrepreneurs in residence. So there's the core team, me, Nikki, and Michael. Then there's entrepreneurs in residence. Some of those are available to you 2 days a week. Some of them are available 5 days a week. You book in time with them. And then you also book in time with domain experts. Although we also might, for some of the domain experts, will come in and run workshops, but we keep it's not a teaching program, right? I mean, obviously there are things that if we think, okay, yeah, you would benefit from getting some training in basic entrepreneurial finance, we'll give you that, right? That's fine. But it's not when you're not like signing up for a class, right? This is not a master's degree. This is a venture builder, right? Your primary work is to build the venture, and we do what is necessary to provide you with just-in-time learning for the things that you might need to know as you go through the program. Okay, now I'm really going to pause and take questions about the program. Unmute yourself or type in the chat. Amor asked how do we work with investors? So that's two parts, right? So we got some investors who are angel investors who've invested in our fund that invests these £75,000 chunks. And then at the end, our pockets are not deep enough to make all the investments that our ventures are going to need at the end of the program. So we have talked to lots of investors who want to, institutional investors, let's call them, who want to invest in these types of ventures. Right, Andrew. So our North Star metric, this is the fashionable phrase at the moment, the North Star metric is, as you say, reducing carbon emissions. Here's the way we think about it, Andrew. There is a very clear harmony between the urgency of capitalism and entrepreneurship, which is really, it's quite an urgent process. You heard me talk about acceleration and so on, and the urgency of addressing climate change. Right? We're not proposing any entrepreneur trying to sell something that people don't want, right? So to me, that would be a definition of a non-profit organization, an organization which is going to, which is trying to get people to do something that they don't want. You have to create a value proposition that the customer actually wants, right? So if you're selling to consumers, as I said, you have to solve people's problem in a way that is superior to their current way of solving that problem, or at least as good, and is also of lower carbon intensity, right? So let me give you an example. Impossible Foods, right? So Impossible Foods was started by a team out of Stanford University, explicitly with a mission to reduce carbon emissions, right? That was their raison d'etre from the start. They said, we need to develop a meat substitute that is good enough to be in the mainstream, that is not a sort of a soy burger type of product, but is something that is going to drive cattle out of business, right? Cattle are a major problem for climate change. They emit greenhouse gases at both ends, and they also use a lot of land, which really and the way that cattle raising uses land is very problematic for carbon, right? You don't have the kind of vegetation that's soaking up emissions on grazing land effectively. So we're fundamentally, we're just not interested in doing nonprofits. It's not our business model apart from anything else, right? Our business model is we find and foster ventures that are, sorry, I should have finished the Impossible Food story. So Impossible Foods, the Impossible Burger is a burger which is it's a meat substitute, but they went to market by selling in upmarket San Francisco eateries to make it cool and trendy, right? A little bit like Facebook started at Harvard. And now they have a contract with Burger King, and in all Burger Kings across the US, you can buy Impossible Burgers as just part of the menu, right? Their whole, the whole mission was from the start, plant-based food is less carbon intensive than beef. Cattle are the big problem. We've got to replace cattle, right? And their market share is going crazy. It's a very high potential sort of business. So I hope I've answered your question, Andrew. Please do. Right. How do we measure a venture's carbon drawdown potential, right? So that's my next slide. What we're looking for is what's called, and it sounds, Rohan, like maybe you have some familiarity with the area, what's called avoided emissions, right? And so with avoided emissions, what you're doing is a life cycle analysis that looks at what is the business as usual case, and a life cycle analysis that looks at if your innovation succeeds, what's going to be the effect on emissions, right? And so the difference between those two scenarios is the potential avoided emissions that you're going after, right? So part of that analysis is what you're referring to as scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, where we're interested in what's the carbon intensity of generating some good or some service and putting it in the hands of the end user. That's scope 1. What are the emissions associated with the energy that the customer consumes when they use the good, right? So if you think about your iPhone, scope 1 emissions, how much emissions did it take to get that product in your hand? Scope 2 emissions, well, you're charging it all the time, so that's energy that you're consuming, and you're also using servers, which also consume energy. So that's scope 2 emissions. And then you have scope 3 emissions, which is all the indirect emissions. Now, the challenge, I should say, for entrepreneurship in this, when you think about scope 1, 2, scope 2, scope 3, is that the people ultimately at the United Nations who came up with scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 weren't thinking about entrepreneurship and innovation. They were thinking about major corporates, right? It's the document that tells you how to do all of this scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions is over 1,000 pages, and it's looking at questions of you know, how do you measure the emissions from an aluminium plant, right? You know, there's a different kind of greenhouse gas that's not CO2 that comes out of aluminium plants, right? It's very, you know, very technical. Yeah, look, so we do, yeah, the questions are coming in thick and fast, which is fantastic. I've got to scroll back up. So Rohan, I hope I answered your question. If I didn't answer your question, give me a follow-up in the chat. Wissam, transformational approach, not incremental. You got that? Excellent, thank you. Yeah, so we ask you in the application process to tell us your idea. Do we really care what your idea is? To be honest, you know, if I read it and I go, wow, that's extraordinary, and also Nikki and Michael, right? If the three of us read it and we say, oh, that's an extraordinary idea, obviously we're going to be impressed, right? But what do we know about entrepreneurship? We know that the idea that you have in your head right now that maybe came to you in the shower, or, you know, you were talking to some friends in the pub and X whatever, right? That idea does not closely resemble what you will actually be bringing to market. That's just the way it is, right? Unless you are deeply, deeply familiar with the space, really already understand the customer, you are the customer, you know, unless you're that tight into like, okay, how does the customer's worldview work? What alternative choices do they have? Until you understand that, there's no chance that just an idea, oh yeah, that's going to work, right? So yeah, you know, if you have a sophisticated, interesting idea, of course, we're going to look at it carefully. But just as you say, team ideation is way more effective than individual ideation. So there's sort of two ideation phases. One is, hey, we help you come up with ideas for things that you might like to pursue. But then once you formed your team, it's almost like you start again. And I mean, not literally, you know, it's not, you forget everything that you know, but you start again and look at the question through a new lens. And very soon we're going to come to the slide, and I must make sure I leave enough time for it, about where good ideas come from. Specific, Callum, specific industries, categories around which candidates will choose to coalesce. Yeah, well, okay, so the 5 emitting sectors are energy, transport, mobility and logistics, agriculture and food, manufacturing and materials, buildings and construction, right? If you look at any sort of top level analysis of, you know, what are the economic activities in the world that generate all the emissions, it's basically those 5 areas, right? So we have a hunch that, you know, that's where a lot of the opportunities are. We also see opportunities in telecoms, not because it's a major emitting industry, but because 5G and Internet of Things based innovations have a lot of interesting applications to problems in the 5 emitting sectors. We see opportunities in green finance, where, look, the financial sector is pretty innovative already, but we need certain innovations within green finance to kind of push, to make it possible for money, which is, remember, a social construct that we've all agreed to, you know, treat very seriously, flows in the direction of things that are going to keep the planet habitable, rather than things that are destroying the planet or destroying the climate at any rate. Supply chains, yes. Consumer behavior, yes. Right? Consumer is like another sector, right? Consumer, ultimately, consumer, if you think about it, can be tracked back to the other sectors, the other emitting sectors, manufacturing, energy, mobility, etc. But yeah, the consumer ventures are sort of a different skill set and mindset than corporate facing ventures. Andrew, what would I recommend for a technical founder who would like to better understand the commercial aspects? Now, I hope I'm not going to come across as flippant. What I'm going to say is, I would recommend teaming up with a really seriously great commercial person. You know, I mean, obviously I could give you a reading list, And really, I'm going to drop my email address at the end. And seriously, if you want a reading list, I'll send you a reading list, right? I've been putting entrepreneurship reading lists together for much of the last 20 years, right? So it will be my pleasure to do that for you. But if you want to get, I mentioned before, it's not a teaching program, it's a venture building program. So if you want to get on and build rather than read a bunch of blog posts and interesting books, then you need to team up with somebody who's already done all that, right? Who's already, I hope that makes sense. Rose, are we advertising this internationally? So we're in Cambridge. When we started in March 2019, it seemed entirely plausible to us that, of course, people are going to come from all over the world to participate on this program. And we have got, applications have been open for a while. We've got quite a lot of applications already. We can see that people are planning to come from different places. In this COVID world, people making grand international travel plans seems to be a less common thing. One thing's for sure, right? To achieve this sort of the 10 million ton target, right? That is very rarely going to be a UK specific business, right? That is typically, I mean, if you're talking about doing something that only sells to customers in the UK and takes 10 million tons, you're talking about taking 0.25% of the whole emissions base of the UK yourself. So that's not very plausible, right? It needs to be something that has international ambitions. And just as you say, one of the reasons we think entrepreneurship is so important here is because a lot of the changes that we need to see are not in Northern Europe, they're in other parts of the world, right? So we want our ventures to be thinking internationally from the start. Okay, Wissam. So the structure of the investment. So it used to be nice and clean and simple. We used to say, when we invest that £75,000, it's for 9.5% of your equity. And then we also take a right to follow on and to take part of your, invest part of your next round, right? We have changed it slightly to what is called an advanced subscription agreement. So this means that rather than our investment at the 4-month stage buying a specific amount of equity, it is buying a right to subscribe for shares the next time you raise money, to basically participate in the round the next time you raise money. This is good for you. It's good for both you and us, because it means that we avoid a tricky negotiation about how much your business is really worth, right? We see how much your business is really worth when you get to the next round of investment. And the piece that the Carbon 13 seed fund, as it's called, takes of your business is more if your business is worth less, and less if your business is worth more. I hope that makes sense. Very happy to follow up, have a specific conversation about this with anybody. Yeah, look, Rohan, absolutely right. We're not going, well, domain experts have a fluency. Well, fluency is a big word. I do have domain experts who are doing business in renewables in India. I don't have any equivalent Chinese domain experts as yet. I've still got a few months to find them. The first steps of the venture are typically, it's absolutely right that you must think about the medium term, but the first steps of a venture are almost certainly going to be rooted in Northern Europe, right? That first customer is unlikely to be in India or China, right? The goal has to be to do something or to build a value proposition that has wide applicability and will be useful in India and China, build up a base of operations, build up some proof points, some credibility in Northern Europe, and then work to expand into other parts of the world as well. Right. Now, I mean, look, that's not an absolute prescription. You could convince me as an entrepreneur that you think the right way to do it is to start in, and you've got just the right set of relationships that are going to mean you're going to be able to access that first customer in India, right? There are plenty of businesses that are headquartered in London that are trying to solve various energy consumption problems around the world. There are obviously challenges about doing that, but it's a plausible thing. It's a feasible thing to do. All right, I'm going to press on a little bit. Keep asking questions in the chat, but I'm going to press on. Right, so I hope it's clear. I think it's clear from the questions I've had that you're getting the point. We're not looking for, there's this phrase called greenwashing, right? So greenwashing is, hey, basically we're not really doing anything, but we certainly talk about doing something a lot. And it sounds good, and people engage with us because they sort of like the idea that somewhere underneath all the layers of talking about emissions, there must be a real value creation engine going on. I've met plenty of greenwashers over the last 18 months, right? People who are genuinely concerned about climate change, genuinely trying to do something, but the best idea they could come up with was not really that needle moving of an idea. I do not have a problem with that person, right? Because that person is not, I don't think that person is a bad person who's just trying to make a buck off people's gullibility. I think that person just needs to be working on a more high potential idea. They need to be devoting their life to something that's a higher potential idea. There are 11 apps on the App Store, 11 active, being updated all the time apps on the App Store that are helping people track their, in the Apple App Store, iPhone App Store, that are helping people track their carbon emissions. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it's ever going to work. Of course, I could be wrong, right? What do I know? But I don't think that's ever really going to make a big difference to carbon. But what I do know is that's 11 teams who are working like hell to try to do something about carbon. And what I would like to do is reach out to those teams and say, hey, work on something higher potential. Try to change the game. Don't just, do something that, you kind of get user traction for, right? So that's the will. I don't mean to sound all sort of Nietzschean or something, but the will of the entrepreneur is quite, that's the sort of underlying ingredient here of actually getting anything done. We don't force an ideology on you, right? We don't do anything where we're saying there is a we have a certain way of looking at climate change in the world, and first step is you have to adopt our purity test, and then we'll allow you to, get working, right? You are the entrepreneur. We exist as an enabling force. You have to figure out what is the right message, what is the right ambition, what is the right model that you're going to take out into the world, right? The whole point here is to get variance. So if we squeeze out a source of variance by saying, sign up to these 5 principles, and then we'll work with you. However, you can hear in everything that I'm saying that what we're interested in is avoided emissions, actual substitution, where we're really actually changing the picture. So Kenneth, you're sending me some nice direct messages in the chat, private messages. That's awesome. I do want to engage with you. Please send me email. chris.coleridge@carbon13.com, or there'll be on the last slide, right? Okay, so I've trailed this for quite a while, so I finally got there. Good ideas, where do they come from? Live in the future and build what's missing. It's not my phrase, it's Paul Graham, who founded Y Combinator, the granddaddy of startup accelerators. If you think about, there's change going on all the time, political change, social change, technical change. The entrepreneur's job is to knit together the new things that are possible because of that political change, that social change, that technical change, and come up with the economic change, come up with the new economic arrangements that make the economic world match the political, social, and technical world. Right. So how do you do that? You go and, this is the reverse of Andrew's question about if you're a technical founder and you need more commercial understanding. Well, if you're a commercial founder and you need more technical understanding, you go and hang out with the technical people. No problem, Rose. I'm running late. I'm running to the end. Second, originality is massively overrated. Massively overrated, right? Given that the idea that you came up with in the shower, a bunch of other people are thinking the same things around the world because they can see the same social change, the same technical change, the same political change that you can see. B, the idea is only really a good one if it's one that you can execute. And C, the idea is only really a good one if it's actually, when you bring it into contact with customers in the real world, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So there's a lot of entrepreneurial opportunity that comes from understanding what other people are working on and learning from that and tweaking it and coming up with your own version, right? You could look at Project Drawdown. If you've not looked at that and you're interested in the space, look at drawdown.org. You could look at the Elemental Accelerator, which is an accelerator based in Hawaii that's funded just nearly 100 sustainability startups, and it's worth learning from those business models and figuring out, okay, interesting. You can take ideas from other places and start them in the UK, right? You can take ideas from other places and say, yeah, they've basically got it right, but they should be aiming at a different customer. So that's who I'm going to aim at. Often the pioneers of an idea don't spend enough time thinking about how cool is this? How much is this going to kind of resonate with the customers? How scalable is it? Is it simple to kind of make it big? Or is it require a lot of little step-by-step stuff? Right. You follow the founder's core endowments. This goes back to Wissam's point earlier in the questions about a team coming up with ideas tends to come up with better ideas, a founding team, than individuals working on their own. Partly because you're combining two networks, you're combining two perspectives, you're combining two skill sets. And then the fourth way of thinking about where do good ideas come from is solve a problem that other people don't want to solve. Solve an expensive problem. Right? Okay. In the low carbon startup space, and maybe this goes back to Andrew's question about nonprofits, right? These are the four types of innovations that entrepreneurs are needed to bring into reality. Right? Entrepreneurs tend to be the ones who come up with business model innovations. Established companies, if they're making profits, they want to defend their current profits, and that's their priority ahead of innovation. Right? It's very rare, very vanishingly rare, that you see companies genuinely cannibalizing their existing revenue and profit streams. They talk about it a lot, but they almost never, ever, ever do it. It is, the history of business tells us that it's entrepreneurs who come up with these business model innovations. If you look at the circular economy, right? So fundamental idea of circular economy, less stuff moved around less. That's less carbon intensive, right? Less movement and less stuff in the chain. chris.coleridge@gmail.com is also will work for you. But I said chris.coleridge@carbon13.com. But yeah, you happen to get my Gmail address correct, so why not use that? That's fine. Corporates are really interested in the elements of the circular economy that will cut their costs, but they are not able to commit to the elements of the circular economy that they are that cannibalize their revenue streams. Look at BMW, right? BMW has been working for over 10 years on a shared car ownership club. Now, why have they not made it work? History tells us that it is not BMW who's going to make a shared car ownership club work, because how does that help them? Right? How does that help them with their core business, which is selling cars? Right? it is entrepreneurial businesses that will make shared car ownership clubs work, or not, right? COVID may have put paid to the whole shared car ownership dream, right? We may have to come up with some new ideas for how we're going to fix the mobility and transport systems. Second kind of innovation that has to come from entrepreneurs is what we call cross-disciplinary innovation. And in simple terms, I can say, why do we have fintechs? We have fintechs because we have this new technology, it's not that new, but relatively new technology, digital, and we have fairly conservative companies, banks, financial service providers, right? Fintechs exist because the banks can't get their minds around how to innovate around using digital themselves. So fintechs are reinventing financial services using digital technologies and then selling it back to the banks. Well, we need to, and we are actually, to be fair, seeing the same thing in construction, same thing in mobility, same thing in energy, that you have new low carbon thinking from entrepreneurs, and then they sell it back to the corporates. Entrepreneurs are able to get going with businesses that rely on some change in the regulations in a way that corporates really can't, right? Corporates don't like to take the risk. They think, well, what's the difference? We might as well wait until the new regulations are actually written and then we'll invest. Entrepreneurs are able to say, okay, this is the way I think the regulations are going. I'm going to build a business that's minimally viable at the moment, has a survival business model at the moment, but once a carbon tax comes in, for example, is going to be hugely profitable. One of our advisors and investors is a chap named James Vaccaro, who is a senior banker at Triodos Bank for many years, a sustainability bank. And he suggests that, you know, in entrepreneurship, we talk a lot about the total addressable market, right? What is the potential market for a particular product or solution? If you think about the carbon price, right? The best estimate I can understand of where the carbon price is going, you know, partly I was told this by James, is $300 a ton, right? So if your business has the potential to take 33 million tons of carbon out of the emissions out of the system, that's $1 billion opportunity, right? And I know that sounds flippant. I mean, even as I say it, it sounds flippant in my mouth, right? But that is the scale of the opportunity that we're talking about. Businesses that get going now to leverage the opportunity that arises if there's a carbon tax are putting themselves in the way of a rather substantial wealth creation opportunity, right? The ones that wait until after the carbon tax comes in and then start are going to be behind in the race. And finally, behavior change. I gave the Impossible Foods example, right? A corporate, you know, Nestle, Unilever, these guys were not going to come up with the Impossible Burger, right? They would have looked, if somebody had proposed the idea, they would have said, okay, yeah, how big is the vegan market? How big is the vegetarian market? What slice of that do we think we can take? What's the ROI from this, right? Impossible Foods started because a crazy climate guy said, I want to drive cattle off the face of the planet, and this is my game plan for doing it, rather than saying, hey, here's the slice of the vegan market I think I can take, and that's a business opportunity I get behind, which is the only way that Nestle and Unilever can engage with these questions. I mean, I'm being slightly unfair to Unilever in particular, that's very sustainable, relatively sustainability minded as a corporate, but nonetheless, the fact is that corporates just think of, when they engage in an innovation project, they're not thinking, well, could consumer behavior be changed? They're thinking, yeah, what slice of the market do we think we're going to get? Whereas, and entrepreneurs just don't really think that way. Okay. I'm 5 minutes over time, so I think I'm going to cut to the end. Sorry about that. Here's my email address and our website. Very, very happy to hear from you. Very happy to receive your applications. If you know, I think we're on course to get something in the neighborhood of 2,000 applications for this cohort 1. But if you know somebody good, tell them to apply. If you're good, you should apply. Right? This is really the most important. I mean, you know, I know I'm the chief salesman for this project, but I really believe this is the most important way you could spend the next 10 years or 15 or 20 years of your life, is founding a business that is directly addressing the major existential problem of our time. Thank you very much for your time and engagement, and hope to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I have a really quick question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, fire away.
Just to give me some clarity, so if I've applied and I'm going through the program, and as things are developing, someone in my network who hadn't applied but I think could bring value, let's say, for instance, someone I know who's doing work with low temperature thermal grids or some kind of perovskite kind of chemistry, and I want to bring them in. Carbon-13 would be there to sort of help facilitate that, bringing them in some sort of meaningful way. Or no, I'm expecting that.
Yeah,
we want to try and keep it.
Look, we're pragmatic, and if you're working on something and you need a particular team member and that person just didn't happen to apply to the program, we're not going to screw the whole thing up based on a set of preconceptions about how it's supposed to work, right? Okay. We have to, you know, obviously our whole business model, the reason investors are, you know, I've invested in what we're doing is that we have to take stakes in ventures, right? Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart pretty quickly, right? So as long as, you know, as long as that basic condition is still in place, then yeah, we'll work with you to get the right team together. There's an assumption which you've heard me describe that in the first phase of the program, you're going to team up with somebody from the program, right? The ideal founding team size, according to all the research and according to my practical experience, is between 2 and 4. So that gives a reasonable, you know, you could team up with somebody, some great commercial person from the program, plus your engineer mate who, you know, is the exact right holder of the exact right IP that you need, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that gives me some clarity on it. That's kind of what I was understanding is, okay, that's more just sort of there is some sort of flexibility there regarding that. Thank you.
We're not crazy. We're trying to, we're trying to reduce carbon emissions here. That's the objective. Right? Okay. Oh, there's the chat. One more chat message. When will we make decisions? So November 28th. So everybody who applied before Monday, sorry to those of you who didn't apply before Monday, everybody who applied before Monday, you're going to get a decision about whether we're inviting you for interview on, well, yeah, 28th of November is still realistic. It might be earlier, could be earlier. If you didn't apply before Monday, then you're not going to get a decision about whether we're inviting you for interview until January. We were just wading through a lot of applications, and we're doing it for the first time. So we're learning a lot while we're doing it. So that's exciting too. Thank you very much. Don't hesitate to drop me an email for any further questions. Have a good evening.
Good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.